Historically, humanitarian aid missions were initially designed to help those global citizens who were abused by their government or other oppressors. Over time, these aid missions have morphed into peacekeeping and information gathering type missions. Anyone can look back into recent history, however, and refer to the Holocaust or Somalia, Ethiopia, and even this Syrian humanitarian crises to understand better how American armed forces played a key role in humanitarian aid. Why America does not respond to every humanitarian crisis, just one of the many reasons why, as an example, that American military does not respond to humanitarian aid in the Far East would be that it could result in catastrophic loss of life, and that there could be economic sanctions for not only both North and South Korea, but it would or could result in global economic sanctions in large amounts. There would be an international global supply chain interruption, and that would both negatively impact American forces and it would negatively impact any supply chain worldwide. And American forces choosing to respond to humanitarian crises would also possibly cause the debt level in the United States to soar exponentially because of an intervention in North Korean affairs. So an ethical argument for why the United States is morally and or ethically obligated to react to international human rights crises is that there are so many who believe that the American government and the American armed forces have to intervene and they have to get involved in humanitarian rights crises because they are often in allied nations areas. And if we are to maintain connectivity and interest in these areas, then we have to go in and support our allies and what goes on in those areas. And if there are terrorist activities or if there are foreign entities who wish to go in and disrupt and disturb the peace and to terrorize our allies, it is our obligation to go and support our allies and to relieve whatever the humanitarian crisis is in that area. Take a moment here and look over this depiction of Aristotle's morality and how morality works. It's Aristotle's morality diagram. And think about it as being a promise keeper. This is Aristotle's depiction of morality, and it's a diagram of how morality works. Take, for instance, if somebody borrows money from you and they make a promise to then return that money, they have a moral obligation to return that money to you. The same argument is then if the United States, or for the United States and humanitarian aid. If America promises to take care of their allies, then America has a moral obligation to do so. Likewise, if the allies have promised to take care of the United States, then those allies have a moral obligation to take care of America and the Americans. Initially formed to prevent and stop human rights abuses, the United Nations has grown and expanded larger than its original purpose and vision. The leaders of those countries who are all members of the UN have since discovered that they are in service to their citizens and are even discovering what it means then to be a servant leader. They're international humanitarian aid organizations like the ICRC or the International Committee of the Red Cross. This includes the Red Cross and the Red Crescent and other NGOs or non-governmental organizations are concerned that the more that the U.S. military intervenes and gets involved in international humanitarian crises, the more frequent violent attacks on their organizations and on their personnel and their aid workers and their aid stations will become. If you go back and you look at the World Health Organization hospitals, and you look at even here in the Ukraine, you can see where some of the hospitals are getting bombed. And if you look at the events in Syria where hospitals are bombed and the ambulances are being riddled with bullets and RPGs, you can see where some of the consternation comes from these aid workers. There is a large argument against American military involvement in international humanitarian matters, and it is growing exponentially. More and more Americans are growing weary, extremely tired of the United States' involvement in worldwide affairs, and that argument is getting louder by the day. And it's a collective belief that the United States has got to take care of the crises that's on the home front before it can attend to anybody else's humanitarian needs. There's the humanitarian need of homeless veterans, of homelessness in our own streets, of the gun violence that is also seen as a humanitarian crisis. There's the humanitarian crises of inflation, of the border problem, of illiteracy, and all of these problems are here on the home front and on American soil. And the question has come, why are we not taking care of Americans and Americans' needs? Why are we sending so much money and so many lives overseas and not taking care of our own? The American military often finds themselves sent to situations where they are not wanted. Such was the case in Somalia. The Somalians did not want Americans in their country. They did not want the American military, in particular, in their country. They didn't want them there, and they were angry when the U.S. military arrived. And in a show of support for their country, the Somali government attacked and violently attacked both civilian aid workers and military service members. And this resulted in several casualties, both civilian and military. During the Battle of Mogadishu, this was perhaps one of the most contentious events of humanitarian relief, and it resulted in catastrophic losses of life and catastrophic losses of trust amongst those who were in desperate need of aid, and the loss of trust of those who wanted to provide aid relief. Those aid workers were very hesitant to ever go back into that area, which then caused a greater humanitarian crisis for those who needed the aid relief. Quite often, the United States military will attempt to force themselves into situations that are too large for them to handle. And they force themselves onto and into countries and areas without having an understanding and without having the training to properly assist and provide the humanitarian aid that is required of the situation. And the military then becomes a greater hindrance than they are a help to those who are in need. And they then become a detriment to the aid workers who are in that area. Prime example is the situation that occurred in Iraq in the village of Qasr. So instead of helping the villagers in Qasr, and instead of addressing the need for clean water and working with the local villagers and local national government to set up healthy drinking water and establish a healthy drinking water supply system, U.S. service members erected a playground. And it was a plastic playground. And they provided their own rations for the villagers. Once the military left the area, they then also took their daily rations with them. So the villagers had no daily support, and they were honestly worse off than when the Americans first arrived to the area. So to wrap this up, the U.S. has to learn, and they have to be able to convey and transmit to the international community that for future aid missions to be successful and to continue to be successful, American forces cannot be the sole provider of peace and humanitarian aid. It is up to individual countries in crises to take the lessons that aid workers provide and to teach themselves to grow and sustain themselves.